And hello, everybody. Today is the 2nd of February. It's a Tuesday, and this will serve as our meeting requirement for the day. I am posting a screencast. I am asking you to watch this one and the first one if you haven't yet. And you will need to answer the questions and fill in the chart that are found on the first screencast. This will get you through most of the questions, if not all of the questions, and will also help you fill out the chart, which we will go over in class when we meet on campus tomorrow. I am not feeling particularly well today. I don't have COVID, but I'm just a little bit run down and achy, so this is what I am doing instead of a full meeting. The screencast will last about 6 to 7 minutes. So there were a lot of changes that occurred in the period between the war. We talked about some of the social changes with the rise of women and how rise of women gaining independence and how that led to a lot of social, cultural changes. And we also were just talking about the celebratory mood of the Roaring '20s, that the war was over. It was a time of excess. But it wasn't just all partying going on in the 1920s. There was a lot of other things, and we're going to be looking at some of the advances in science and in arts and literature. Marie Curie, she worked a great deal with radioactivity and discovered how elements can be changed by interacting with each other. Einstein built upon her ideas with the theory of relativity and how we measure time and space, and it challenged Newton's view of a fixed universe that worked on unchangeable laws. Enrico Fermi used the findings of Curie and Einstein, and he worked on splitting the atom, fission, which later on, after he moved to America, he worked with Robert Oppenheimer and Teller, and they worked on the Manhattan Project, which the end result was the creation of the atomic bomb. Alexander Fleming discovered penicillin, and penicillin was found kind of almost one of those mistakes of science, that he was working with bacteria and he discovered that mold had grown on the petri dish and it was killing the bacteria, and so working with non-dangerous parts of the mold, he was able to create an antibiotic which is used in many forms over the years and is one of the biggest gifts to mankind ever. So we can see that there were quite a bit of advances in science. In the mental science and science of the mind, Freud developed the theory of psychoanalysis, which is used by many practitioners of psychiatry and psychology, although some of the findings have been disputed and disclaimed. But basically, he shows how the inner person is conflicted with their desires, what they want to be, which are often formed in childhood, and the world that they're forced to live in, and this creates tension and stress. Freudian psychology and psychiatry is making a comeback in the last 15 to 20 years. For a while, though, it was greatly challenged by other types of psychology, such as behaviorists, etc. But Freud his inputs on science were huge because it's all science. And all these theories challenged held assumptions at the time. The Roaring '20s were roaring in the sense of science discovery as it challenged models and paradigms. But the Roaring '20s also met its critics. We've talked a lot about the novel All Quiet on the Western Front, and this novel showed the grim reality of war, and that war is not an adventure, but it's a horrible event. And it's heaped upon people who don't end up fighting it. And they blindly promote the war, and the young men who fight the war bear the brunt and the burden and the horror of the war. I really recommend you read this book, or at least see the movie. It's free on Netflix. It's a remake of the original. It's a very poignant and well-done movie. The book is fantastic. We talked a lot about the Roaring '20s and the party attitude and the flappers and the playboys and all the rich mansions. The Great Gatsby is one of the classic American novels that challenges the emptiness of this party-on lifestyle and how it leads to emptiness. It's kind of like taking William Blake's essay on excess leading to nothingness, but then eventually leading to wisdom, he said. But Gatsby is just basically saying how once the party is over, it's empty, and it's nothing, and it's all vanity. It's a great counterpoint to the idea that the Roaring '20s people were happy, many of them were miserable. Gertrude Stein is an American poet, and she talks about this time period as the lost generation, the people who were basically had their minds framed in World War I and the Roaring Twenties, that they were lost between horror and excess. The novel Virginia Woolf uses Freudian theory in its plot about how the mind is at conflict in everyday actions, and it causes the protagonist of the story great harm. It's a really interesting book. The Harlem Renaissance was a movement in New York where African American musicians, writers, actors, dancers, all were living in an enclave of tremendous creativity, and among them was the American poet laureate Langston Hughes, whose writings are a huge part of American poetry and hopefully are required of you in other classes. So try to read some of these books. Learn about what these people were thinking, learn about what they were hoping, learn what they were fearing. I did not mention The Sun Also Rises is a novel by Hemingway, and anything by Hemingway is usually good. And it talks about, again, the idea of people who have no values, and they're just lost in the moment between the generation of war and the Roaring Twenties, and finding both to be very empty experiences. In contrast, he later on writes a book about someone who does get involved in a cause, although it costs him it's a horrible debt, but it's an American who becomes in the fight for freedom in Spain, and that's a tremendous novel, and it is entitled For Whom the Bell Tolls, and that's kind of the antithesis of the novel that he writes on. He writes about The Sun Also Rises, about these people who have no values and causes, and a young man who does dedicate himself toward the conflict in Spain. So that's all for today. Again, I am sorry that I was not able to be in class with you today. I'm just not feeling particularly well, but I did want to give you some support for your assignments. You need to make sure that the worksheet that I gave you on Monday is done, and you really should have a good bit of the vocabulary done since we're not meeting. So having said that, have a great rougher day. See you tomorrow.